Rosemary Dobson is one of the most graceful and adroit poets we have in Australia. And it's an interesting fact that her grandfather was a very well-known English poet, Austin Dobson. Rosemary, did he have any influence on your work?
I don't think he had any direct influence. I certainly read his work, but I think that a great gulf separates us not only in time, there were only 2 generations, of course, between us, but because so much has happened in poetry between his lifetime and mine. He died actually about the year I was born.
Yet it's a strange thing that you both have a similar urbanity and humour. You both write period pieces. You both write poems about pictures. And that must be unique, this granddaughter-grandfather relationship of poets, I should think. I don't know of anything like it.
I don't know of anything like it either. I think that I started to write poetry before I knew that my grandfather also wrote poetry. I started quite young, as most people do, about 7, I think.
Your best-known poems, perhaps, are poems about paintings. How did it come about that you've written so many of these?
I've always been interested in painting. I decided pretty early on that I wanted to be a poet, but I was very interested in poetry, and the 2 interests have been parallel all the time. I've studied painting, and I paint for pleasure, but I look at paintings for pleasure too.
Do you keep the painting up?
We go away for holidays, and I take my paints. That's about all now.
You did study, you told me, with Thea Proctor once.
Yes, I had 2 years with Thea Proctor, and I think that the interest in art and the discipline of learning something about another art contributed quite a lot to the writing of poetry. I still find that I sometimes am thinking of the technique of poetry in terms of the technique of painting. I learnt this, I think, through studying with Thea Proctor.
You did teach art yourself for a while at Frensham, didn't you?
Yes, I was at school there, and when I left school, I had 3 years of teaching, and I taught history of painting and history of architecture. These were things that I just had to keep a jump ahead with, and some painting as well.
Well, now, this was before you went to England. You must have been teaching in a way from reproductions and photographs of architecture, that sort of thing.
Yes, because I'd always been interested in it from my own point of view, just looking at and studying history of painting.
But then the impact of Europe when you went across there as a young woman, it must have been terrific.
Yes, it was, indeed. Mostly, I think, the Florentine school, I spent only a fortnight in Florence, but that was a tremendous experience for me.
Did most of the picture poems date from after that, or you'd written a number before?
Well, I had mentioned paintings in some of the earlier paintings. There's a poem called In a Cafe about a Botticelli painting, for instance, which was before I went overseas. But the group of painting poems that are in Child with the Cockatoo all belong to the period when I returned from overseas.
Some of our friends, the critics, have accused you, I think, of producing second-hand works of art based on paintings. I think this is pretty unfair, isn't it?
Well, I feel that if a painting arouses a response in a person, that response is sufficient to stimulate a poem, then it's something very real to the poet, and it can't be said to be second-hand. Also, another point against this is that some of the painting poems that I wrote were about imaginary paintings.
Or things like commissioned altarpiece, I think. Was that one of them?
Yes, that was one. Commissioned portrait was another. There were about 4, I think, that were about paintings that didn't exist.
The poems read as if they're about real enough pictures, of course.
Oh, yes, well, many of them were, yes.
Now, there's a poem that I think you refer to in the preface of your own recent book, The Raising of the Dead. This is, I imagine, a real picture. The raising of Lazarus.
Oh, yes.
Moved by the miracles of saints, the child restored, the leper healed. Through the black plumes of death, I watch the intervening angels step down the blue sky across the field. To see the young man raised to life, the soul return to shuttered eyes, they crowd in faded radiance where underneath an orange tree so inexplicably he lies. There's more than one level of meaning in this poem.
Yes, its starting point was a real painting. It was a painting of the Sienese school, rather a minor one, And the painting, as I've described it, is rather different to the original. But I developed it, I think, in that I was really hoping to make a point of the young man who is returned to life in the painting. He's glimpsed paradise, but because he's in a painting, he can't ever return to paradise. It reminds me, perhaps it was influenced by the poem of Browning's, The Epistle from Karshish, in which Lazarus is raised from the dead, and for him life thereafter is completely altered. But for this young man, he can't, like Lazarus, die again, so he remains in his painting.
It's very interesting. There are layer after layer of meaning. You can skim them off. What's the story behind one of the best known of these, The Child with Cockatoo? It's a painting of Verelst, isn't it?
Yes. I really am grateful to the author of a book called, I think, Life in a Noble Household, Gladys Scott Thompson, who wrote from the archives of the Bedford family. And she described this painting in her book, and she outlined the theory which I've used in the poem about the bird having come from overseas and perhaps from Australia and arrived in England and being given to the family and therefore painted in the portrait with the child.
It's probably a sulphur-crested cockatoo, do you think?
Yes, this was the idea she had.
This picture has been seen in Australia, hasn't it?
Yes, I'd never seen it when it came to Australia. Previously, I'd only seen it in reproduction. When I wrote the poem, I hadn't seen the real thing.
But it came out in the Duke of Bedford's
yes, that's
collection.
Right, yes.
There's another very striking one, Rosemary, The Bystander. This is another picture painting. I am the one who looks the other way.
Yes.
This is, have a look at it there. It's in the book. This is one that's always fascinated me, and I think it's probably very well known, among the best known of your poems.
Yes, it's been reproduced in anthologies fairly often. It stemmed from an interest in the relatively unimportant people in paintings, the bystanders, the people who look on but don't take an active part. I was thinking particularly of the Bruegel paintings, and in that third verse there are references to two of Bruegel's paintings in which people are observed as details.
Which verse is that? I am
the silly soul. Will I read it? Who looks too late, the dullard dreaming, second from the right. I hang upon the crowd, but do not mark, cap over eyes, the slaughtered innocents, or Icarus, his downward plunging flight.
That's the Bruegel picture with Icarus's legs disappearing into the sea, and
That's
the ploughman
right.
goes happily on his way.
Yes. And the other one, of course, is the Massacre of the Innocents, with the people just standing around.
Another of your interests seems to have been for a long time the craft of printing. You've written Country Press, and then that wonderful poem, The Tiger, where the sort of soul of the poet's caught in these stripy lines of print and the alphabet. Have you actually worked as a printer or with a printer?
Yes, while I was at school, or towards the end of the time I spent at school, I was assistant to the printer. We had a printing press there, a platen press, with which, of course, one could do quite a lot. The chief printer was Joan Phipson, who's made a name for herself as the author of children's books, and I helped her. We attempted quite a number of ambitious things, but it was a great experience for me because I learnt quite a lot about printing, about the basic techniques of printing anyway.
You've got a trade if you're ever stuck for a job, you can go.
Yes.
At first sight, I think your poetry has a very suave look, and it looks polished and urbane, and would it be fair to say rather feminine?
Well, I hope not. I think this is something that I've consciously tried to
get out of,
overcome. Yes. I
Yes.
wouldn't like to have the criticism of being too feminine levelled against me, and I think I've consciously tried to make a fairly disciplined and strict and perhaps strong, I don't know whether it is, but I've tried to make a fairly strong tool of verse, and I'd rather be judged as a poet, in fact, than as a poetess, and I think that's fair. I think one could.
Well, fair enough. But I raise that, of course, because there are actually several of your poems that I think you can only describe as rumbustious. There's Traveller's Tale, the old sailor who's getting a drink, isn't he, from the character for telling a story. And it's a dramatic monologue, that, isn't it? There's possibly an influence of Browning in it.
Well, I think so. I think that I certainly read a great deal of Browning, and I think this has had an influence on a number of poems at one period anyway.
And then there's a good deal of humour in these rumbustious poems. Were you telling me that you first used humour in The Fisherman and the Moon?
Yes, I think that was about the first time. Before that, most of my poems have been rather juvenile and gloomy, and as one often is when one's starting out and writing.
You say there's a verse here, "Fisherman, what have you caught tonight? A netted river hall of stars and a dregged moon that shakes with cold, half drowned in shifting darknesses."
Yes, well, that poem began actually with that line, "A netted river hall of stars." I was actually, I'd gone to a concert, and this line came into my head out of nowhere, as lines so often do, and I had the feeling that it was better not to try and use it at once, and I wrote it down when I got home, and the next day I wrote the poem straight off. And being very anxious, very lacking in confidence, and very anxious to know whether it was any good, I took it down to Douglas Stewart at the Bulletin. I didn't know him as well as I know him now, and I was very much in awe of him. But I didn't know he was a fisherman, and of course he was delighted with the poem for that reason, because it's about fishermen. But the odd thing about that poem now, I think, is that, a number of years later, I wrote a poem called The Passionate Poet and the Moon, which provides a kind of answer to this poem. Yes. In the first poem, Endymion is accused of wronging the moon. In the second poem, Endymion murders a poet, so yeah. He gets his revenge.
Evens things up.
Yes.
We agreed there was an apparent influence of Browning in some of the stuff, but I can't see any influences at all in the series of The Devil and the Angel. They seem to be quite your own, and they're extremely humorous poems. What started them off, Rosemary?
Well, I wrote the first poem. I can't remember now the circumstances of writing it, but once I'd written that, I began to see that there were possibilities for making a series. These people were all to be interviewed by the Devil and the Angel as they were about to die, and they were to be offered the choice of heaven and hell by the Devil and the Angel. And in every case, they don't say either. They say both, or they say, I'm glad you came, more or less,
well,
as Methuselah does. And yes. The cartographer wants to explore both heaven and hell.
They couldn't care less which it was. They'd both be interesting for a map maker, yes.
And the poet, of course, feels that they've come too soon, and he manages to outwit them. That was where I stopped. That was the number 8, I think.
Yes, there's the same rumbustious in Captain Svensson, which is quite a recent one, but what I like there so much is the description of the sisters in the hospital. Lying in the hospital, I heard the white-veiled sisters neigh, tossing their veils like fillies. How on earth did you think of that? That's wonderful. And then they say, the white-maned sisters prance like fillies on neat white hooves. It's so like a nice lot of nurses. But was Captain Svensson a real old character who was lying in the hospital
Well,
there?
as far as I know, he was. You see, my room was outside the telephone room where all the nurses had their conversations, and I heard quite a lot about Captain Svensson. It wasn't his name. Yeah. But the Mariners' League was certainly interested in him, and he was very interested to know when this yacht race was starting. He struck me as being a character rather like a Slessor character.
Yes, like some of Ken Slessor's things. Until you were married, you had various jobs. You were a teacher at Frensham, then you ran the Navy for a while, didn't you, in the war?
In a brief period as a cipher clerk, yes.
And then you went into publishing.
Yes.
Was it easier to write then than it is now, when you've got 3 young children and all the jobs of a housewife, and plus some lecturing and anthologizing and television?
Well, I had then much more time for thinking, and this is important, but I've always written each poem at a sitting. The difference it's made having children and constant interruptions is I find that lately I've written poems still at one sitting, but a day or two later I've found that they're quite wrong, and I've had to recast them in an entirely different form. I make those sort of mistakes now, yes. And I think that's due perhaps not to having thought these things out enough beforehand.
This seems to be perhaps quite crucial, because it seems to me that your poetry took on quite a new character after you became a mother, and you began to open up new depths to. Do you feel that happened?
Yes, In a new book which I've just completed, there is a whole section of poems dealing with the birth and growing up of young children. It has opened up a new field, I suppose, for me as a poet.
They seem to me to be more personal, the poems. Do you think that's so?
Yes, they're more personal, but I'd like to think that they were personal
and universal.
And universal, yes.
Yes, that's the essence of it.
Yes,
Poetry can
yes.
be as personal as anything, but it's got to be universal
Yes,
too.
yes.
For instance, Cockcrow, I imagine you must be pleased with that one. This is a poem where it's all on your back too much and you go out alone and you walk along. Everybody feels this.
Yes, yes. Yes,
True,
well, this
isn't it?
was a real. I remember this occasion very well. I was looking after my mother who was ill, and my daughter who was very young was with me, and I just had this feeling that I wanted to get out by myself and be alone. And I think this is an essential condition for anyone who is doing creative work. I'm sure everyone must find it so.
Yes, and then there's a return and the reconciliation with the normal son.
Yes.
Do you feel that there's a whole world of female experience that women poets have hardly begun to explore?
Yes, and I think this is where Judith Wright has made one of her most important contributions, because she's opened up this field in her poetry, particularly with the volume Woman to Man, which is beautiful, of course.
This is possibly only can come about now in modern times with a certain, I suppose, liberation is the word, is it, of women? But when you look at women's poetry from Sappho right away through to Elizabeth Barrett Browning and the Rossetti Girl and all the rest of them, they don't seem to have begun to scrape the surface of it.
No.
I think
the time is right, perhaps, for.
It seems to me that your new poetry is beginning to penetrate this. Don't you feel that?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
You think you'll keep on doing it?
I think so. I hope that I'll go on finding new themes with each experience, and I hope I'll still be doing this when I'm quite old.
I get the impression, Rosemary, that you've begun to range more widely for subject, perhaps in the last few years. Do you feel that yourself? A ghost town in New England, for instance.
Yes.
And the charming poem Jack in the Box, how did that one come to be written?
Oh, well, the children were given a Jack in the Box, and they played with it constantly, and we all got a great deal of amusement for it. And I suddenly began to see it, the whole thing as it might be from Jack's angle, and then I saw Jack as though he might be ourselves, as though we might be like Jack in a box, shut down in our flesh and blood, in our own bodies, crying out to be let out. And in the end of the poem, I make this point, and I say, that's enough, we mustn't start thinking in this way and giving toys these ideas. I mean, these...
And that's when, but with a sudden brutal thrust, I caught his head and pushed him back, shut him back in his box.
Yes.
Perhaps there are things that we shouldn't let out of their boxes.
Yes.
I think it's a reasonable argument. Are you conscious of looking for lessons, possibly even for morals, in the subject matter that you treat?
To a certain extent, because I'd like my poetry to be as strong as it can be, and this might give it more weight, say, more point. I think it's the poet's task to illumine everyday experience, not necessarily to teach or to point out a moral, but I think to illumine is right, perhaps.
Yes.
Yes.
It's not didacticism, but it's opening up,
Yes.
revealing,
Yes.
laying bare the secret life of things, perhaps. Yes. I noticed that among the later poetry that you've been rehandling classical themes in modern settings. Leander, for instance, what that poem's called Across the Strait.
Yes.
How on earth did you think of that wonderful idea? It's a marvellous poem.
I don't know how the idea came to me, but it was the second one of a series I've been doing on mythological subjects, treating them as though they might have happened at present day.
One of them's Andromeda.
Andromeda, yes. Andromeda, I've made she's a demonstrator of a slicer, a sort of patent slicer at a fun fair on a seacoast town, and the monster is the crowd who comes round her, and she's thinking might attack her, and she's rescued in due course. That's Andromeda.
Who is your Perseus? He's the clown, isn't he, or
he's
something?
the circus clown, yes.
But Leander is a young man who comes down to go and see his girlfriend, and he's faced with the stream of the traffic, which is the deadly Hellespont, of course. He plunges into it and is lost.
Yes, that's right.
But it must be quite fun.
Oh, it is.
Working this.
I don't like. I'm always a bit afraid of talking about things that I'm going to do beforehand, because I feel that you dissipate your ideas in talking about them. But I have done 4 of those mythological poems, and I hope to do some more.
Have you any favourite verse forms?
No. I did write a lot of blank verse earlier. Now, lately, I seem to have been writing more regular forms with irregular rhyme.
Yes, your use of rhymes is becoming quite interesting. What are you after with them?
Well, I'm after making the rhyme quite seem apparently accidental, but really be used for emphasis or for surprise or just for a sort of chiming sound. It's a use of a very irregular rhyme with a very regular meter. That's what I've been doing lately, I think.
Is it true, by the way, that your poems are being translated into French?
Yes. Practically all of my published poems have been translated into French, and this has been a terribly interesting experience for me. They've been translated by 2 people working in collaboration, and the interesting thing is that one person is Dr. Margaret Diesendorf, is in Sydney, and the second person, Monsieur Louis Dauteuil, is in Switzerland, and he is a poet himself. Dr. Diesendorf went abroad and took one of my books as a present to Monsieur Dauteuil, and he suggested to her then that they work together in the translating of them. And they're perfectionists, really. It's terribly interesting to see the work they've done with the poems.
They're not landing you in the situation of wishing that you'd been writing in French yourself all the time.
Well, one poem certainly was much better in French than it was in the original version, and I feel that very strongly. But they're beautiful, the translations. I feel very fortunate.
It seems to me they should go well into French. Do you think that there is anything in the possibility that you've got a sort of affinity with the French? With one of your family names is de Brissac, which is
yes,
a French one.
Somewhere back in the family. Dr. Diesendorf felt that there was some affinity between my poems and French poetry. I don't know about this, but she certainly thought that it was for this reason easy to translate it into French. Well, not easy, it's difficult for them, but they can surmount these difficulties. Yes.
Lend itself. There's a clarity and a cleanness of line in your poetry that would lend itself, I think, very well to the French. One other thing, you live in the city, but you never seem to have lost touch with the country. Do you visit the country a good deal, or when you write your country poems, are you more or less reliving your school days at Mittagong?
Oh, some of each, I think. Certainly, I think back to the country, but also we're very fortunate. We visit friends in the country every now and then, and these are periods of, well, refreshment, really. And I quite often write country poems as a result of these visits. The poem, The Rape of Europa, which is one of the mythological poems, begins off beautiful Europa while the billy boils, which was written after I returned from one of these country visits.
Do you use real experiences in some of them? For instance, Chance Met, that's a fairly early country poem, but a wonderfully fresh poem. Sounds as if that was a real experience.
I can't remember anything about the writing of that now. I expect it was, yes.
Leander, of course, the Leander, they cross the straits, very much a city poem.
Yes.
But the conversation now, how did that one come to get written?
I don't remember the writing of that. It was quite a number of years ago. I should imagine it came directly from some country experience.
Some old chap that you met?
No, it wasn't a real person at all, no.
But he built up in your mind
yes,
into a thing.
Yes.
It sounds completely real. I wonder if you'd read it to us.
Yes, certainly. The conversation. His old fist like a knotted branch he punched into his cap, meaning, this is a morning. The mist like white scarred wool is teased and spread about the hills. The valley's bales are full. I nodded in agreement and likewise punched my hat, seeming to say, at noonday the wind will comb and spin that fleece of mist to thread of cloud, and night will wind it in. His hand to the horizon he waved in careless joy, observing by this gesture, as I was quick to know, that over the hills lay China, and both of us should go. As silent as two fence posts, years ago we stood, having such talk as only children and fools may try, that excellent old madman, wordless and wise, and I.